Welcome back to Dimensional Shift. This is Revi here. This week I wanted to talk a little bit about the paradox of good versus evil and the idea of the Ouroboros and the yin-yang symbol. There is a lot of darkness in the world right now, and in a certain sense we have gotten very imbalanced. And I think that a lot of us are angry about the way the world is and we want to make change, and that's a very good thing. But I found that a lot of people are using that anger in very strange and destructive ways. In this world of duality, the good versus evil polarity is part of that duality. And while non-dual teachings are pointing to awareness, many people start with the idea of non-duality by merging this idea of good versus evil. So rather than it being a war between one and the other, we can see it as a spectrum with good on one end of the polarity and the evil or the darkness on the other end of the polarity. And in this way, we shift back and forth in this sort of cosmic dance. And right now we are in a very dark time. And we do need to have good works brought into the world. The problem is that people are not really understanding what good works are. We see this a lot when we want social change and social justice, but those kinds of things get taken advantage of, whether by the people themselves that distort the message, or by, dark outside forces that are trying to manipulate the perspective. You can see this in the way the feminine movement was distorted. First, it was about women being able to be themselves and to make choices for themselves and have independence. And eventually it has strayed into this sort of man-hating, antagonistic energy, and there's a reason I don't call myself a feminist because of that. And it's the same thing with every social justice movement that we've had, where it gets distorted and warped. It goes too far into that polarity. So when we have this desire to do good, we have to really think about what that means. It doesn't mean that we go full French Revolution and take people to the guillotine and start chopping off heads. When we really want to bring good into the world, number one, we have to think about our daily actions. Are we consciously, intentionally, intuitively choosing to live in the moment, to be compassionate, to use kindness, to be aware of what we're saying, of making good choices in our behavior, in the way that we take care of ourselves and take care of others? All of these things bring so much good into the world, more so than any kind of actual movement might. A movement makes a statement to the world, but the real change happens every day in our lives, in our homes, with the people that we're around and affecting and loving. So don't let this idea of what is good get warped in your mind. I've noticed that that's almost, in a certain sense, kind of a psyop that's going on, of we're going to have this big movement and we're going to bring down the system and, all this. And the system itself, from my perspective, it's going to collapse under its own weight. And it will be up to us, the people who are ready to surrender to the divine will, or however you want to say it, God, Source, Creator, the ones of us who have reconnected to nature and know how to live with the land and do these self-sustainable activities and work with animals and plants and all of that. And those of us who are willing to come back into community and support each other are going to be the ones who are going to shift to the new world or new society, or however you want to say it, going forward. It's going to be a matter of skills and knowledge and compassion and trust and all of those things that we talk about. The good versus evil duality or polarity, it's an Ouroboros. It's the snake that eats its own tail. It's also the yin-yang. In a certain sense, it's inescapable because we do live in a dualistic world, a world of polarity. I don't think this is necessarily all worlds. I think that there are absolutely places that those laws don't apply to, but the law of polarity does apply here. And so when we have this polarity of good and evil, the problem is we can go too far with the idea of good, and it circles right back around into the idea of evil. That's the Ouroboros. And we've seen this in, like I said, these social justice movements and some of the religious figures and movements and everything that we've had. Time is going to warp everything, and there's a purpose for that. Because if time didn't distort and warp everything, then everything would stay the same. Time inherently doesn't exist, but our perspective of it does. It may change daily or moment by moment, depending on how in the present you are. But if you really zoom out and look at time, and you look at this Ouroboros and the rise and fall and the cycles of time, it's fascinating the way it contracts. And at this time, we're in a time of contraction. We're in this very pressurized, contracted point in time. And eventually that's going to collapse on itself, almost like a star collapsing on itself. And then it's going to explode. Whether you want to think that as like a wormhole into a new timeline or dimension or whatever, or just like a supernova, and we're going to go through this period of growth and peace and all of that. So the point is, be very careful about what projections we put on the idea of good, because every action has a reaction. And all events are entangled in this beautiful Indra's net of jewels, or the sacred geometry. So when we want to really make sure we are doing good and doing the right thing in the moment, that's a very conscious, intuitive thing. So every action we have has an impact and it has a reaction. And the bigger the action, the more energy you put into an action, the more statement it makes, the more reaction it's going to have. And sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes that's just the way it has to be, as long as we're prepared for the reaction that's eventually going to come. And this can come on a karmic level. It could be over lifetimes. This could be on a very immediate level. And eventually time reconciles that too. So while all good things may turn to dust, eventually from the ashes something new will rise. And that's what this place is. That's what this place does. That's the purpose of time. Is these periods of growth and decay and growth and decay. And we see this in the seasons. We see this in the cycles of life. It's just part of it. So I really want you to think about what good is, what being loving means, what actions you can take in your daily life to bring joy to people, to bring joy to the world, to bring love into the world, to listen compassionately, to show yourself compassion and kindness. There's all sorts of ways to be life-affirming. I think of good as life-affirming rather than destructive. And if you want to think of good versus evil, we also have creative versus destructive energy. It's a different kind of way to say the same thing. It just takes a lot of the judgment off of it. So if we have a creative energy, we're bringing something into the world. And we can actually see how we are discouraged from doing that. We have all of this very logical life, and it's all very boxed in and squared, and you don't want to think outside the box. And the system wants us very limited and compartmentalized. They don't want us creating. You can see there's been like this war on art, and you have to be rich to be able to even afford art supplies, and writing and podcasting is basically talking to the echoes in the void on the internet. How many people really listen? How many people really read? It's very difficult to get your name out there unless you're paying for advertising. Organic growth is basically dead. And we've had sort of this war on allowing people to create. And that's a destructive energy. And that's why this destructive energy is also, in its own sense, good. This destructive energy that we have going on right now, if we can stay outside of it in an observant sort of way, we can watch this destructive energy and the way it's going to bring down the system and the complex and everything that we are suffering under. Now, does that mean that we aren't going to have to be prepared for when that happens? No. I've been thinking about putting together a think tank and discussing with some people about mutual aid groups and having places where people can go, if a city goes sideways or the grid goes down or whatever it is, having some places where people can go and having some transportation available in case we end up with another Holocaust, these kinds of things, and people who are willing to really step up. And I think that that's a big thing that we need to look at too, is right now a lot of people are comfortably uncomfortable. That means that they're uncomfortable, but they're not so uncomfortable that they're willing to do something about it. And this has been kind of a slow decline and a slow decay of our values and the world and our society at large and just the way we live. And it's been going on probably, I don't really know, in America maybe 200 years, but worldwide, much longer than that. But COVID really woke people up because it was suddenly so uncomfortable that we were like, whoa. And I think it had a larger reaction than they were expecting. And while there are going to be more issues that come up in order to keep restricting us, it's going to be a matter of making the choices that are aligned with our values and are aligned with what is right and what is intuitive, and people being willing to step up and make change, even for themselves. Boundaries, saying no, and it's going to be a difficult no. It's going to be giving up things, giving up comforts in our lives that we don't want to give up. But that's what it's going to take going forward. That's what's going to be needed going forward for those who are looking to come out on the other side. I also want to make a note here that death is not to be feared. I think the fear of death is much, much more destructive than death itself. To me, death is going to be a quick step to the right. There's various theories on all of this. I think that my belief is closest to what they call quantum consciousness, where you have a moment and you don't even realize you die, And it's just like one of the versions of you, one of the timelines of you, the parallel lives of you stops, but you keep going. And it's just like a shift in awareness, a shift in attention of where you are, which parallel you're in. It's really hard to explain. You might have to look up the idea of quantum consciousness. The movie The Discovery kind of shows it pretty well. But of course, I think that we can also consciously choose before we die where we want to go next, if that's something that you really want to look into, is choosing your next life. And I think that's valid too. And no, it doesn't have to be on Earth. Everything that could ever exist exists. It could be your wildest imagination. So consciously choosing where you go after death might be something to consider. But the point is, the fear of death is one of the most controlling and limiting factors that we have in this world. And if you can face and overcome the fear of death, then that is one of the most liberating things you can do. And it is through that we can see that this good versus evil game is a game. And we don't have to play it. And number one, we are liberated from this feeling of it has to go one way or the other. This thing has to win, because we get to step outside of time and see the way it rises and falls. But also, when we die, we have this process of like the life review. Like, that's an actual thing. This is when I go to drink ayahuasca, I do a life review with Mother Ayahuasca, and not like my whole life necessarily, but like where I am in life. And I look at my recent actions and am I living the way that feels aligned, that feels like when I actually die, I will be complete enough to leave. And then you can go into the whole non-attachment, detachment, all of that too. That's an important part of that. The life review process is a way that we look at all of the darkness inside of us. And when we look at that, and it's generally in a non-judgmental way, hopefully it's in a non-judgmental way, but that's when we really find compassion for other people. And that's where we really connect to that non-judgmental, complete acceptance, unconditional love. Because if I can see that I am inherently perfect while also manifesting as an imperfect being, then I can also see that about you. And I can see that everything anybody has ever done that may be considered evil or dark is done from a place of fear and lack, which I also have had in my life. Or it's done from a place of trauma and fracture, which I have also had in my life. And in this way, we are all the same. We are all living in this intricate web of action and reaction. And so a lot of the Zen and Eastern philosophies, that's why they focus so much on being non-judgmental and being non-reactive, because we have found we are all one, and we have found that everything everyone has ever done has been because of some kind of chain of events, and that's just the way it is. Everything is relative, and everything is based on every other action that the world has ever had, that has ever happened in the world. So finding compassion is a really important part of that. And that's all from this stepping outside of the cycle of the yin and yang. And we also see how the yin and yang has its value in this world. And it does. We get to play this game of good and evil, and when we tire of it, we end up here in spiritual awakening, because we don't want that anymore, and it's time to move on to new games somewhere else. I don't often quote the Bible, but I think that this quote is an important one, and it's paraphrased. I'm paraphrasing here. But let he who has not sinned cast the first stone.